Hi friends, what's up and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I'm going to be ranking all of the recent palettes I have tried. I have 12 palettes to rank, so we're going to dive into it, grab a snack, grab something to drink, and let's get into this palette ranking. The number 12 spot is going to go to this palette right here from e.l.f. Cosmetics. This is the Intergalactic palette. Now, e.l.f. came out with new 10-pan palettes, and this is the one that spoke to me the most. I feel like with this palette in particular, e.l.f. tried to make two palettes in one, and I feel like the color story just didn't really pan out very well. I found myself having a very hard time trying to figure out what looks I could create with this palette, and a lot of the shimmers, though they are pretty when the light hits it, they are really chunky. This is still one of the better formulas at the drugstore, but I just was not very impressed with this palette. Before I even tried this palette, I was like, you know what? I have high hopes for it. I'm hoping to pick up more palettes, but after trying this one, I just don't see myself running out and buying the other palettes because it was just a little bit underwhelming for me. For $10, it's decent. Maybe the other color stories are better. I feel like the mattes, I had to really build them up to get some kind of pigment. Shimmers showed up, but overall, I just wasn't very impressed with this palette like I thought I was going to. 11 goes to this one right here from NYX Cosmetics. This is the Ultimate Warm Neutrals palette. Now, NYX did send this palette over to me, and I was able to try it out and really get a feel for the formula. I've tried the old formula, so I definitely could compare the two. And with this one, I feel like the mattes in this palette are so blendable and so smooth. I've created some really beautiful brown smoky eyes, and anytime I want to go for a brown smoky eye, I've been reaching for this one because the mattes are truly worth it for me. Now, the shimmers in this palette are basically like your generic, basic, satiny shimmers. They don't have really intense sparkle to them, but when I was in Ulta the other day, I did look at the other palettes, and I feel like those shimmers are more like textured and, you know, really have that grit to them, whereas this one is just like regular non-sparkly metallic shimmers. I do want to check out the other palettes just for the mattes. The mattes are truly worth it for me, so that's why I ranked this one at number 11. Coming in at number 10 is the Natasha Denona Yucca palette. I love the color story of this palette. I knew when it was first sneak peeked, I just had to have this palette because it is so beautiful. I love it. And the shimmers stand out to me 100%. I feel like this shimmer formula in this palette is very different from shimmers in other palettes. I'm not too sure if it is, but I just feel like the quality on these shimmers is so good. It's like she improved this formula. Mattes in this palette, some are hit or miss for me. I feel like I do have to build up some of the colors a lot to get it to show up on my skin tone, or I have to go in with a lighter base to get it to show up. Now, there is another palette in this ranking that is very similar to this one that is ranked higher, and I do prefer that palette more than this one, but this one is coming in at number 10. I love the shimmer formula. I feel like this palette overall is best suited for me as a companion palette. I know some people that's a deal breaker, and I completely understand because a palette that costs this much should be able to stand alone on its own. But for me, I found that I want to reach for a couple of deeper shades because there's only so many deep shades in here, and I feel like when I constantly reach for these same 3 deep shades, I get very similar looks every time I pull for this palette, and that's half the time that's not the vibe I'm going for, so I have to reach into other palettes to really get the effect that I want with this palette. But overall, every time I do use it, I enjoy the looks that I create. It's just is more of a companion palette for me. Next in the ranking is the ABH Cosmos palette. We'll say the packaging on this palette is not my favorite. For a Galaxy Cosmo-esque theme palette, I was expecting a little bit more out of this. I feel like they kind of missed the mark with this one. For the price of this palette, the packaging could have been a little bit better, a little bit more thought could have been put into it. I say all that to say the color story is very beautiful. I love the fact that ABH kind of stepped out of their comfort zone. They still gave us a neutral palette, like don't get me wrong, it's still pretty neutral. You have different types of shimmers in here. They're really beautiful duochromy, not really the typical shifts we see from ABH. Now, if you've been eyeing any of the newer ABH palettes, the formula on all of the palettes is absolutely beautiful. I think it just really comes down to your color story and your preference, but I like this palette a lot. Is it my favorite color story in a palette? No, which is why it's ranked where it is, but I love the formula and I love that ABH is going in this direction. Hopefully they keep it up and we see more different palettes and more unique palettes from the line. Next is the NOMAD Cosmetics Safari palette. I have been really loving the palettes that NOMAD has been coming out with lately. They've really been killing it. Down to the packaging, to the color story, they definitely killed it. So the packaging kind of feels textured, where it almost feels like you're petting an animal. It gives more of an immersive experience, I'd like to say. This is the color story, and this is the palette that I said is very similar to the Natasha Denona Yucca palette. But I do prefer this one. I feel like the mattes show true to color. This palette can stand on its own. They're very pigmented. The colors that you see in the pan is exactly what you get on the eyes. And I do feel like this palette is more POC friendly when it comes to showing up without having to build up the colors or going with a lighter base. So that is a very important thing for me when I compare the two. Now, the shimmers that have more of this animal print in them are pressed really hard in the pan, but they still perform absolutely beautifully on the eyes. I don't really care how they feel in the pan. As long as they're performing on the eyes, that is all that matters to me. But I really enjoyed this palette. It's nice to see a neutral palette from NOMAD because a lot of their palettes do lean pretty colorful, which I'm not mad at, but I know that there is a very big market for neutral lovers, and I'm a neutral lover ally. Even though I love colorful shadow, I still want my neutral girlies and guys to get exactly what they need, okay? Next palette is the ODEN'S Jewels and Gems palette. I do have a full first impressions up on my channel if you want to check it out. And this is one of the palettes. Oh my gosh, isn't this such a beautiful color story? It's so stunning. I love the different textures of the shimmers in this palette. It's so beautiful. But I ranked it where I did because it is a cool tone color story, and I don't really reach for cool tones. I rarely reach for cool tones, but every time I did reach for this palette, I loved the looks that I created. A lot of my looks did lean pretty smoky, but I just love this formula. It's so easy to use and so blendable. I just cannot believe I've been missing out on the ODEN'S formula because it is really good. I'm sure a lot of you who have already tried ODEN'S probably loves their formula, and I just can't believe it's taken me this long to try one of their palettes. Another NOMAD palette that I tried recently. This is not a new palette, I don't think, but it is newer to me in the past month and a half that I've tried all of these palettes. This is their Royal Europe palette. Now, I really wanted this palette because there are 5 multi-chromes in here. There are 5 multi-chromes in here. That alone makes this palette worth it for me. This is a very jewel tone palette. It's very deep, and a lot of the looks that I've created run very sultry, and I mean, you can't really help it with this palette. That's just the tones that were put in this palette. This is definitely my favorite NOMAD palette so far. Like, this is truly my favorite, which is why it is ranked very high. I just feel like these are my kind of tones. It's much more colorful, but truly the multi-chromes is what really makes this palette. They are so buttery and they just glide on the eyes. If you're looking for multi-chromes, highly recommend these. A lot of indie brands multi-chromes are $20+ for a single multi-chrome. You get 5 in this palette. For, I think this palette in total is like $50 something. If you do the math, this palette is way worth it. Like, even if you just wanted the multi-chromes, this palette would still be worth it. I think NOMAD does sell the multi-chromes individually for $12, so that's also still pretty cheap compared to a lot of other indie brands. Plus, you can use coupon codes to bring the price down even lower. But I do think the palette itself is truly worth it. The number 5 spot goes to this palette from GLAMLITE. This is the Scooby-Doo Part 2 collection from GLAMLITE, and this is the palette right here. Now, I've said this in the video of me trying out this palette. I feel like there's so much wasted space in this palette. That's like the first thing my eyes go to whenever I pick up this palette. I'm like, why is it so spaced out? Every single time, never fails. That's my first thought when I open up this palette. Even though I've already seen it, I still think that every time I open it. But it's ranked at number 5 because the formula is still the GLAMLITE formula that I know and love. It is so good. I don't know how their formula got this good, but it is so good. I will recommend any of the newer GLAMLITE palettes because the formula is top tier. You want a good eyeshadow formula that's worth the money? GLAMLITE has you covered. The formula is unmatched and it's that good. Each row is a look in itself. I've had a lot of fun just like creating like a Scooby look, a Daphne look, a Velma look. It's just been really fun to pull from this palette. I do wish that it was a different palette layout itself, but still love the formula. Number 4 goes to a really beautiful neutral palette that I've been having so much fun playing with, and a lot of my looks that I've created are so stunning. It's the Full Fantasy collab palette with Laura Lee and Manny MUA. I cannot help but reach for this palette when I want a really easy, simple look. I love the looks that I create with this palette. I think this is such a beautiful fall theme palette, and I know come the fall time, I'm gonna be reaching for this palette a lot, but it is just so beautiful. I used it earlier today. I did a different eye look today. I literally just played with 2 shades and I was obsessed with my eye look. I took this like purple and this shadow on the lid and I was like, what? It's so pretty. So I cannot wait to play with this palette again and create some more looks. The only thing that I will say is that I do wish some of the transition-y shades were kind of changed out with other shades. I feel like a lot of them lean pretty similar and I feel like we could have had more variation between them, but other than that, I love the palette. I love the color story. It's so beautiful. I feel like this is the Lunar Beauty formula and it's a really good formula. If you haven't tried it, you should check out his palettes. They are beautiful and I love the formula. Number 3 goes to the ODEN'S Stone and Rock palette. This is a green lover's dream. So beautiful. I have had so much fun playing with this palette. The formula is a 10 out of 10, but my favorite thing about this palette, every single tone in this palette shows up on the eyes. I can go on with 4 different greens in this palette and you will be able to tell each color green on the eyes. That is what I love the most about it. I love that every shade in here is different. No shade in this palette is similar. I love that. I feel like this is such a beautifully thought out palette. Absolutely beautiful. That is why it's ranked at number 3. This is definitely one of my favorite palettes that I've tried so far in 2023. We're on a good track with the palettes, but yeah, it's very up there in my ranking. Number 2 goes to a Blend Bunny palette. This is the new Sugar and Grunge palette. Oh, so beautiful. This is a different kind of palette. Definitely not a color story I thought that I would gravitate to, but I should have known that I would. It is the Blend Bunny formula, and I love the Blend Bunny formula so much. I did play with the greens in this palette today on my eyes, and I also went in with my number 1 palette in the ranking as well on my eyes, and I also played with the blue shimmer here because I just wanted to see how it looked paired with the greens, and I really love it. I've been loving the looks that I've been creating with this palette. My first time playing with this palette, I used the purple and the gray. Weird combo that I paired together. Never thought that that would be something I'd pair together, but I had a lot of fun creating such a different color look. And I love palettes like that kind of, kind of push you to try color combos that you wouldn't normally. But I did it because it was like right there. It was in the palette. So I just couldn't help myself. Today, my look was so easy and so simple. I started off with this color and I was like, I need something to blend it out. Then I went to this one and I was like, that's perfect. Now I need something to blend that out. And I went in with this one and another palette and another shade. And I was like, that was just too easy. The mattes blend themselves and she just easily creates the steps for you. You don't have to follow the palette layout, but I do love the fact that that's what I would normally do if this palette wasn't laid out. I'd figure out what shade I need to blend out the previous shade that I put down. Love Blend Bunny because she kind of does the guessing work for you, and I just love it. So that's why this is number 2. It's such a beautiful palette. Highly recommend. And I'm sure you already know what my number 1 palette is. It is the GLAMLITE Rick and Morty palette. Wow, was this release so unexpected. I am loving what GLAMLITE is doing, okay? One of my things that I love, but I also kind of like hate because I get really anxious, is when brands constantly tease product. Like, you can do like 1 teaser, 2 teasers, but if you take a whole week to tease, okay, I'm like, okay, that's enough. Let me see what it looks like now. So I'm like 1 or 2 teasers, cool. It's fun, I get the game, but when you take a whole week to tease something, I'm like, no, okay, hold on, that's enough, okay? Can we see what the product is? But they literally just gave this to us, which I love. That made it much more fun for me. It's like, whoa, this is unexpected. I was not expecting this. And that's what they did with this one. And wow, this palette really is something. This is absolutely a rainbow palette, but it's a rainbow palette of all of the brighter tones in the rainbow. I have every color in the rainbow from GLAMLITE because I love their formula so much that I want every color that there possibly is in their formula. So I'm like, give me more palettes. Give me all the colors you can give me in this formula because it is so good. And this is definitely my favorite palette from GLAMLITE. It was the Barbie palette for a very, very long time, but the Barbie palette has similar shades in here. They're not exactly the same, but they have similar shades. But this palette has more colors to choose from, and you know I love my options, and I love the formula. I just feel like GLAMLITE just keeps getting better and better and better. I'm so here for it. That is it for my palette ranking of all of the recent palettes I've tried. Definitely let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think about these palettes? What do you think about where I ranked some of them? Let your girl know down below. Let's chat it up in the comments, and I'll definitely catch you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.